Have you ever wondered about the meaning of life? Why am I here? And how can I be truly happy? In this series, I will discuss our search for meaning and how Aquinas can help us still today to better understand how we can find true happiness. Welcome to Thomistic Studies. This is part one of a three-part series based on the treatise of St. Thomas Aquinas on happiness. In this part, we will discuss the search for meaning in our lives. The Vatican II document, Gaudium et Spes, which is Latin for joy and hope, describes the problems and questions that faced the world of the 60s, many of which persist today, sometimes to an even greater degree. The Council Fathers give the examples of some of these difficulties, saying that while human beings are increasingly extending their power, they are not always able to control it in their own service. They are intent on exploring the depths of the mind, yet they often appear more unsure of themselves. They are gradually uncovering the laws of their life and society, but uncertain about how to give it direction. The Fathers go on to state that never has the human race possessed such an abundance of wealth, resources, and economic power, and yet a large part of the world's population is still racked by hunger and need, and very many are illiterate. Never has humanity had so intense a feeling for freedom as today, but new forms of social and psychological slavery are on the increase. Gaudium et Spes also points out that the spiritual unease of today and the change in living conditions are part of a greater upheaval, which comes from the growing importance accorded at the intellectual level to the mathematical, natural, and social sciences, and at the practical level to the repercussions of these sciences upon technology. And the Fathers add in this document that these new conditions also affect the living of religion. On the one hand, a more critical judgment is purifying religion of a magical approach to the world and of still widespread superstitions, and is increasingly demanding a more personal and active commitment of faith, such that many people are coming to a more appreciative awareness of God. On the other hand, says the Council, more groups of people are giving up the practice of religion. In contrast to earlier generations, it is not now unusual or just an individual matter to deny God or religion or to abandon them. So all these imbalances affecting the world today, says the Council, are in fact connected with a deeper imbalance rooted in the human heart, where various elements are in opposition. On the one hand, human beings as creatures experience considerable limitations, while on the other hand, they are aware of being unlimited in their desires and of being summoned to a higher life. They are subject to many attractions and constantly compelled to choose between them and renounce some of them. They experience internal disunity within themselves, from which so many disharmonies in society also originate. However, the Council Fathers note that many persons do not perceive this situation clearly because they are so influenced by materialism or are crushed by wretchedness. So they think that they can find peace by simply reinterpreting the events. Gaudium et Spes continues, some, for instance, look to a true and complete liberation of humanity resulting from human effort alone, and are persuaded that the future kingdom of men and women on earth will fulfill their heart's desires. Others despair of any meaning to life and admire the boldness of those who consider human existence completely devoid of significance, and who struggle to give it significance by their own efforts. And yet, faced with today's evolving world, an increasing number are asking the really basic questions or feeling them with a new urgency. What is man and woman? What is the meaning of suffering, evil, and death, which persist even in the midst of such progress? What can people contribute to society or expect from society? What comes after earthly existence? To all these questions, the Council Fathers answer that it is Christ who offers to the human race, through his Spirit, the light and strength to respond to its highest calling, and that underlying so many changes, there are some things which do not change and are founded upon Christ, who is the same yesterday and today and forever. It is accordingly in the light of Christ that the Council proposes to elucidate the mystery of humankind and to contribute to discovering a solution to the outstanding questions of our day. In his book, Man's Search for Meaning, the Jewish Austrian neurologist, psychologist, and Holocaust survivor Viktor Emil Frankl notes that striving to find meaning in one's life is the primary motivational force in man. In the midst of the critical situation of living in a Nazi death camp, Frankl explains, "My concern was different from that of most of my comrades. Their question was, will we survive the camp? For if not, all this suffering has no meaning. The question which beset me," says Frankl, was, has all this suffering, this dying around us, a meaning? For if not, then ultimately there is no meaning to survival. For a life whose meaning depends upon such a happenstance, as whether one escapes or not, ultimately would not be worth living at all. Frankl makes the point in his book that what is demanded of man is not, as some existential philosophers teach, to endure the meaninglessness of life, but rather to bear his incapacity to grasp its unconditional meaningfulness in rational terms. In other words, although one may not always be able to give a rational account for why a particular event has occurred, that does not in itself signify a complete lack of meaning to it. Rather, for Frankl, there is an unconditional meaningfulness to life, even when we ourselves do not have the capacity to completely understand the purpose of every single event. I think this is important to point out. Everyone, whether Christian or non-Christian, seeks a meaning or purpose to life, consciously or unconsciously. This becomes evident in suffering. When we are suffering, the first question we ask is why? Why this suffering? What purpose does it have? A similar question can be asked with regard to our actions. Do human beings necessarily have an end, a purpose, a reason for acting? St. Thomas answers yes, with respect to all properly human actions. That is, all those actions which proceed from a deliberate will, he says. In other words, actions which are not intentional, such as digestive processes or unintentional twitches, are acts of a human being, but are not properly human acts, since they are not voluntary. However, all voluntary acts are necessarily done for some reason or end or intention. This end or purpose for St. Thomas, as for Aristotle, is the final cause of our action. That which we intend when we act may be the last thing in the order of execution, that is, it is the last thing to be executed or arrived at, but it is the first thing in our mind in the order of intention. Therefore, it is a real cause of my acting, Just as when running a race, to use St. Paul's analogy, we strive for the finish line, the end point, which is the goal toward which we are running, and is the immediate reason for our running. So when we act voluntarily, we always act for some end. In fact, adds St. Thomas in the Summa Theologiae, if we were not to act for a particular determinate end, there would be no reason to do one thing rather than another. So, when we have rationally chosen to do a particular action, we have also necessarily determined a particular end or a good for which we are doing it. In fact, for St. Thomas, as for Aristotle, every agent of necessity acts for an end, although only rational creatures, humans and angels, can move themselves toward an end, whereas non-rational creatures are moved toward an end by means of their natural inclinations, or by being directed toward that end by another. Now, although each human action may be specified by a particular or proximate end, or the immediate intention which a person wills in doing that act, one and the same act can also be ordained to several remote ends, of which one is the end of the other. For example, if I were a mother and had a child who were sick, and if there was no medicine to be found in the cupboard, I would have the remote end of obtaining medicine for my child at the chemist or pharmacist, which would involve the multiple acts and intermediate ends of looking for and finding my keys, walking to the door, opening the door, going to the car, getting inside, and starting the car. But if, just as I were about to drive away, my husband were to come running, saying that he had found the needed medicine, immediately my acting for that remote end would stop, and all the other intermediate ends of driving to the pharmacist and purchasing the medicine would also vanish. So you see, the principle or origin of voluntary human action is the end or good, the final cause chosen by the will, that is the object of the will. St. Thomas asks the question of whether or not there is one last end of human life. And it is here when we begin to discover the meaning of life. Is there a final end that all our actions and intermediate ends are ultimately ordered to? One objection in the Summa claims that it would seem possible for one person's will to be directed at the same time to several things as last ends. Some might seek pleasure or repose or the gifts of nature or virtue. But Aquinas answers in the body of the article that it is impossible for one person's will to be directed at the same time to diverse things as last ends. And he gives 3 reasons for this. First, he says, because since everything desires its own perfection, a human being desires for his or her ultimate end that which he desires as his perfect and crowning good. In other words, it is necessary for the last end to so fulfill a person that there is nothing left for him or her to desire, which would not be the case if something were lacking to his perfection. So the last end must be the perfect good for the human person. In fact, for St. Thomas, everyone acts for an end under at least the aspect of good. That is, the person must at least think that the end is good for him or her before he or she will to act for it. No one does something that he thinks will be bad for him, even when the action itself is objectively evil. For example, a thief may steal money because the money itself is a good, even though the means of obtaining the money are evil. Or a person may even murder another person, because in the murderer's mind, the removal of the other person is a good for the murderer. since the other person may seem to appear as an obstacle, for instance, to his obtaining the inheritance. Now, the second reason why St. Thomas thinks there can be only one true last end is because he says, just as in the process of reasoning, one begins with what is naturally known and works toward a further conclusion, so also in the process of willing, one begins by willing that which is naturally desired. So Aquinas believes that each nature can only have one ultimate end, and so the human will can only have one last end, which naturally moves it to act. Thirdly, although every voluntary action receives its species from its end, there must necessarily be something common to all human action. St. Thomas points to the scripture reference in the said contra, on the contrary. He says, no man can serve two masters, from Matthew 6:24. Therefore, the will of the individual must be fixed on one last end, only one. This does not mean, of course, that the same person cannot choose as an end both riches and pleasure, for example. But what it does mean is that these two goods or ends will necessarily be subordinate to the other, one to the other. In other words, there must be a subjective ordering of goods in each one's mind, which can be seen when he or she is forced to choose among various goods. So there's both an objective ordering of goods to the last end as a reality, as well as one's own subjective ordering of goods with regard to one's own choice of the last end. This is why St. Paul can speak of gluttons, whose God is their belly, as he says in Philippians 3:19, since they have set their will on food or drink as their last end. So whatever a person desires, he desires under the aspect of good, and he necessarily desires it as being in some way related to what he perceives as his last end or perfect good, because the complete perfection of something is achieved through the last end. In other words, the true or objective last end is necessarily the complete and perfect good. However, Aquinas points out that one need not always be thinking of the last end whenever one desires or wills something. Just as a person walking along the road need not be thinking of the end toward which he is headed at every step. However, one's intention with respect to the last end remains in every desire directed to any object whatsoever, even though one's thought may not be actually directed to the last end. So I don't have to be consciously thinking of my last end at every moment in order for my actions to be formed and influenced by it. Besides being the complete and perfect good, St. Thomas believes that the true last end must also be unchangeable. He explains that all people agree in desiring the last end, insofar as all desire the fulfillment of their perfection. And it is precisely this fulfillment in which the last end consists. But as to the thing in which this aspect of the last end is realized, all are not agreed as to their last end. Since some desire riches as their consummate good, some pleasure, others something else. Here St. Thomas makes a distinction between the thing in itself, which is the last end, and the acquisition of this last end. Although in a way, true happiness is both the last end and our acquisition of it as our last end. However, the question remains, what is this last end in which the acquisition or possession of our happiness consists? We will discuss this question in the next part of our series on happiness and our last end.